He thought he was ignoring an ordinary family. He never imagined the father standing in front of him would soon become the person responsible for leading his entire department. On a warm evening in Atlanta, Georgia, David Mitchell drove through familiar streets with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter. After decades of serving in law enforcement, David had learned that some of the most important moments in life happened quietly. They did not always come with cameras, announcements, or recognition. Sometimes they happened in simple conversations where people revealed who they truly were. That evening was supposed to be a peaceful family moment. David was not thinking about his career or his future position. He was simply a husband and a father enjoying time with the people he loved. But everything changed when an unexpected situation left his family needing assistance. David believed the answer would be simple. A call for help would bring someone who understood the importance of service. After all, that was the principle he had followed throughout his entire career. He believed a badge was not a symbol that placed someone above others. It was a promise to stand beside them. A short time later, Officer Brian Walker arrived. Brian had spent many years as a police officer. He believed his experience gave him the ability to quickly understand situations. Over time, however, that confidence had become something more complicated. He had developed a habit of forming opinions before hearing the complete story. When he approached David and his family, he did not see the years of dedication behind the man standing in front of him. He did not see the leadership, the sacrifices, or the countless hours David had spent helping communities. He only saw a family he believed he already understood. Sarah noticed the difference immediately. She noticed the tone of the conversation. She noticed that her husband remained calm even though the interaction was becoming uncomfortable. She looked at David, expecting him to explain who he really was. She knew he had every reason to introduce himself. She knew that one sentence about his career could completely change the way Brian viewed the situation. But David remained silent, not because he was powerless, not because he was afraid. He remained silent because he wanted to see something more important. He wanted to know how people were treated when they were believed to have no influence. David understood that a person's true character was often revealed in moments when they thought nobody important was watching. Brian believed he was simply making a routine decision. He believed he was relying on his experience. He had no idea that the father standing quietly in front of him was a respected law enforcement leader who had recently been selected as the city's next police commissioner. He had no idea that the family he failed to understand would soon become connected to his professional future. David did not reveal his identity. He did not use his position to demand different treatment. Instead, he chose patience. He chose dignity. As he left with his family that evening, he carried the memory of the encounter with him, not as a moment of anger, but as a reminder of why leadership mattered. Because sometimes the most important test of a person is not how they treat those who can change their future. It is how they treat those they believe cannot change anything at all. The quietest moments often reveal the loudest truths. David Mitchell understood that lesson better than anyone, but Officer Brian Walker was only beginning to discover it. After the encounter with David and his family, Brian continued his daily routine believing the situation had already passed. To him, it was just another evening, another interaction, another decision made during a busy shift. He had no idea that the moment he barely remembered was one that David would carry with him as he prepared for a new chapter in his career. At home, David sat with Sarah and their daughter, thinking about what had happened. The room was peaceful, but his thoughts were focused on something deeper than the interaction itself. He had spent decades in law enforcement, and he knew that every officer faced difficult choices. He knew mistakes happened, but he also knew that the smallest moments often revealed the values behind those choices. Sarah looked at her husband and asked the question she had been holding since they left. "Why did you not tell him who you were?" David took a moment before answering. He explained that if he had revealed his position as the future police commissioner, the entire situation would have changed for the wrong reason. Brian might have shown respect because of a title instead of because every person deserved respect from the beginning. David did not want someone to treat him differently because of his position. He wanted people to understand that dignity should never depend on status. That belief had guided him throughout his entire career. The next morning, David returned to preparing for his upcoming appointment. Behind the scenes, city leaders were organizing the transition and discussing the future of the police department. They wanted someone who understood both leadership and service. Someone who knew that public trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. David spent hours reviewing plans, meeting with community representatives, and listening to concerns from different neighborhoods. He knew that becoming police commissioner was not simply a promotion. It was a responsibility to create a better connection between officers and the people they served. Meanwhile, Brian continued working without knowing what was coming. He arrived at the station, completed his duties, and spoke with other officers about ordinary matters. He still believed his judgment from that evening was correct. He believed experience allowed him to quickly understand situations. But he had never considered that experience without humility could prevent someone from seeing the complete picture. A few days later, the police department began preparing for an important announcement. Officers noticed meetings taking place. Leaders were discussing changes. There was a sense that a new chapter was about to begin. Brian noticed the activity but did not think much about it. He expected another experienced officer to take a leadership role. He expected someone familiar. He never imagined the name that would soon be announced. As David continued preparing for his new responsibility, he thought about the kind of leader he wanted to be. He remembered the reason he entered law enforcement in the first place. It was never about authority. It was about helping people feel safe, respected, and heard. He knew that a single moment could reveal problems, but he also believed a single moment could become the beginning of change. And soon, the entire department would discover that the quiet father Brian overlooked was the very person who would redefine what leadership truly meant. The days leading up to the announcement carried a sense of change throughout Atlanta, Georgia, but most people did not yet understand how significant that change would become. Inside government offices and police department meetings, leaders were preparing for a new direction. They were not looking for someone who only understood policies and procedures. They were looking for someone who understood people. That person was David Mitchell. For David, leadership had never been about standing above others. It had always been about standing with them. Throughout his long career in law enforcement, he had learned that trust was built through small actions repeated every day. A person could give the strongest speech in the world, but if their actions did not match their words, people would notice. David wanted officers to remember that every person they met had a story. Every family had concerns. Every individual deserved to be treated with patience before any assumptions were made. As David prepared for his new role as police commissioner, he spent time listening to community members and reviewing the challenges facing the department. He asked questions instead of simply giving instructions. He wanted to understand what officers experienced on the streets and what residents needed from those sworn to serve them. He believed meaningful improvement came from cooperation, not distance. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Walker continued his normal routine, unaware that the future of his career was about to change. He walked through the police station with the same confidence he had always carried. He believed his years of experience made him prepared for almost any situation. But he had not yet recognized that confidence could sometimes become a barrier. It could prevent a person from seeing what was directly in front of them. A few days after the encounter with David, Brian attended a department briefing where officers discussed upcoming changes. There was conversation about new leadership and future plans, but no one had announced the details yet. Brian listened casually, expecting the news to involve someone familiar from within the department. He never connected those discussions to the quiet father he had met earlier. He never imagined that the man who had remained calm during their conversation was about to become the person guiding the entire department. That evening, David spent time with his family. Sarah noticed that her husband seemed thoughtful. She knew he was preparing for one of the biggest responsibilities of his life, but she also knew the encounter with Brian had stayed in his mind. David explained that becoming commissioner gave him an opportunity to influence change, but it also gave him a responsibility to understand why moments like that happened. He did not want to lead by simply correcting mistakes after they occurred. He wanted to create a culture where people thought differently before those mistakes happened. Sarah smiled because she understood what made David different. He had the ability to respond with anger, but he chose wisdom. He had the ability to reveal his position, but he chose patience. He knew that the most powerful lessons were not always taught through authority. Sometimes they were taught through the example someone chose to set. The day of the announcement finally arrived. Community leaders, officers, and local officials gathered as the city prepared to introduce its new police commissioner. Brian entered the room expecting an ordinary ceremony. He adjusted his uniform, greeted his colleagues, and waited for the announcement. He had no idea that within moments, the person he once overlooked would be standing in front of him as the leader of the department. And when the truth was finally revealed, every detail from that evening would take on a completely different meaning. The room was filled with quiet anticipation as officers, community leaders, and city officials gathered for one of the most important announcements in Atlanta's law enforcement history. People exchanged conversations, shared expectations, and wondered what kind of leader would guide the department into the future. For Officer Brian Walker, it was simply another official event. He stood among his colleagues believing he already understood how the day would unfold. He expected a familiar name. He expected someone whose career path looked similar to his own. He never expected the person walking onto that stage would be the same father he had failed to truly understand only days earlier. Before the announcement, Governor Michael Anderson stepped forward and spoke about the importance of leadership. He explained that the future of law enforcement required more than experience. It required someone who understood trust, fairness, and the responsibility that came with serving every member of the community. The room became silent as the governor introduced the new police commissioner. Then he said the name, David Mitchell. For a brief moment, Brian did not react. He looked toward the stage, waiting for his mind to accept what he was seeing. The man standing there was not just a father he had met during a difficult moment. He was the new leader of the department. The person he had judged without knowing his story was now the person responsible for guiding the future of every officer in the room. Suddenly, every detail from that evening returned. The calm expression, the respectful voice, the patience David showed even when Brian had not offered the same in return. Brian realized something that was difficult to ignore. David had every opportunity to reveal his position. He could have changed the entire situation with a few words. But he chose not to. He chose to see the truth behind Brian's behavior instead of simply using his authority to stop it. As David approached the microphone, he looked across the room at the officers and community members gathered before him. He spoke about service, responsibility, and the importance of remembering why people choose careers in public safety. He did not mention Brian. He did not use the moment to embarrass anyone. He focused on the future. David explained that a department became stronger when officers understood that every person they encountered deserved dignity. He reminded everyone that leadership was not about being recognized as the most powerful person in the room. It was about accepting the responsibility to make the room better. Brian listened carefully. He expected anger. He expected consequences. Instead, he witnessed something different. He saw a leader who understood that real change came from awareness, not humiliation. After the ceremony, officers gathered to congratulate David. Brian remained quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened. He thought about the family he had met. He thought about the assumptions he had made. He thought about how differently he might have acted if he had known David's position. That thought stayed with him because it revealed the lesson he needed to learn. Respect should never depend on a person's title. It should exist before the title is known. As David began his first official day as police commissioner, Brian realized that the greatest challenge ahead was not changing policies or procedures. It was changing the way people viewed their responsibility. And for the first time, Brian understood that the man he overlooked was not just his new leader. He was the example of the kind of leader Brian needed to become. The first days of David Mitchell's leadership brought a different atmosphere to the police department. Many officers expected immediate changes, strict instructions, and a leader who would simply remind everyone that he was in charge. But David approached his new responsibility in a way that surprised many people. He did not begin by showing power. He began by listening. He walked through the department, spoke with officers, and asked questions about the challenges they faced every day. He wanted to understand the reality of the work from the perspective of the people carrying out the mission. To David, leadership was not about creating distance between himself and the officers. It was about building trust from the inside out. Officer Brian Walker watched carefully from a distance. He noticed that David did not act like someone who needed to prove his importance. He noticed that the new commissioner treated everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of rank or position. That was difficult for Brian because it reminded him of the evening when he had done the opposite. He had looked at David and his family without knowing their story. He had made a decision before understanding the people standing in front of him. Now, every interaction with David became a reminder of the difference between authority and leadership. A few days later, David held a department meeting to discuss his vision for the future. Officers filled the room as he explained that public safety depended on trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. He told them that every call, every conversation, and every decision mattered. A single moment of respect could build confidence. A single moment of unfair judgment could damage it. Brian listened closely because the message felt personal. David was not speaking only about policies. He was speaking about choices. The choices officers made when nobody was watching. The choices they made before knowing someone's background, career, or influence. After the meeting, Brian stayed behind for a few moments. He watched as David spoke with younger officers and answered their questions patiently. There was no sign of arrogance. There was no desire to remind people of his position. Instead, David acted exactly as he had acted that evening with his family. Calm, respectful, focused on understanding. Brian began realizing that this was the reason David had become a leader. It was not because of the title. It was because of the character behind it. Meanwhile, David continued working on his plans for the department. He created opportunities for officers to improve communication, strengthen community relationships, and remember the responsibility behind wearing a badge. He believed training was not only about learning procedures. It was also about learning perspective. People could not serve a community they refused to understand. One afternoon, Sarah asked David how he felt about working with Brian after everything that happened. David looked thoughtful before answering. He explained that everyone faced moments where they had to decide who they wanted to become. Some people ignored their mistakes. Others used those moments as opportunities to grow. He believed Brian had the ability to choose growth. That belief represented everything David stood for. He did not want to lead through fear. He wanted to lead through example. As the department moved forward, Brian began to see the meaning behind David's actions. The man he once underestimated was not trying to prove he had more power. He was showing that the greatest responsibility of power was using it wisely. And slowly, Brian started understanding the lesson that would change the way he viewed his career forever. A true leader does not ask people to respect a position. A true leader earns respect by the way they treat people when they have every reason to do otherwise. The relationship between David Mitchell and the police department continued to develop as more officers began to understand the vision behind his leadership. He knew that changing a department was not something that happened through one announcement or one meeting. It happened through consistent actions and the willingness of people to look honestly at themselves. For David, the most important changes were not always the ones that appeared in reports or public statements. They were the quiet changes happening in conversations, decisions, and attitudes. Officer Brian Walker felt those changes more than anyone. Every day, he carried the memory of the moment when he first met David and his family. He remembered how quickly he formed an opinion. He remembered how certain he felt at the time. But now, with a different perspective, he began to understand how incomplete that judgment had been. He realized that experience did not always mean understanding. Sometimes, experience could create habits that prevented people from seeing situations clearly. One afternoon, Brian received a message asking him to meet with Commissioner Mitchell. For a moment, he felt nervous. He wondered if this was the conversation he had been expecting. Since the announcement, he wondered if David wanted to discuss what happened that evening in front of everyone. When Brian entered David's office, he prepared himself for a difficult conversation. But instead of anger, he found calm. David invited him to sit down and spoke in a respectful tone. There was no attempt to make Brian uncomfortable. There was no desire to make him feel smaller. David simply wanted to have an honest conversation. "Do you remember the night you met my family?" David asked. Brian looked down for a moment and admitted that he remembered. He explained that he had spent a lot of time thinking about that night. He admitted that he had made assumptions before understanding the situation. He admitted that he had allowed his own perspective to influence the way he treated people. For the first time, Brian was not trying to explain why he was right. He was trying to understand why he was wrong. David listened carefully. He explained that accountability was not about destroying someone because of a mistake. It was about recognizing the mistake and deciding what to do next. He told Brian that every person faced moments when their character was tested. The important question was whether they learned from those moments. Brian asked David why he never revealed his identity that night. David answered honestly. He said that if Brian had known he was speaking with the future police commissioner, the lesson would have been different. Brian might have changed his behavior because of a title, but David wanted him to understand something much deeper. Every person deserved respect before anyone knew their importance. That was the foundation of true service. The conversation stayed with Brian long after he left the office. He realized that David had every reason to use his position against him, but he chose something more powerful. He chose to create an opportunity for growth. Later that day, Brian walked through the same department halls he had walked through for years. The badge on his uniform looked the same. The responsibilities were the same. But his understanding was different. He no longer viewed authority as the ability to make decisions for others. He saw it as the responsibility to make decisions that respected others. Meanwhile, David continued leading the department with the belief that people could improve when they were given the chance to understand. He knew change required patience, but he also knew one person's willingness to grow could inspire many others. And for Brian, that lesson became the beginning of a new chapter. The greatest leaders are not the ones who use power to prove they are right. They are the ones who use power to help others become better. The conversation between David Mitchell and Brian Walker became a turning point, but David knew that one conversation alone could not create lasting change. Real transformation came from what people chose to do after they recognized the truth. Inside the police department, officers were beginning to notice a different atmosphere. The focus was no longer only on procedures, statistics, or daily responsibilities. There was a growing understanding that every action represented the values of the department. David believed that a strong police department was not built only through rules. It was built through character. He wanted officers to remember that every person they encountered was someone's family member, someone with experiences, challenges, and a story that might never be visible at first glance. Brian Walker carried that message with him every day. The memory of his conversation with David remained clear. He often thought about the question David asked him. Would he have acted differently if he had known who David was? The answer was difficult because Brian knew it was true. He might have changed his behavior because of the title, but now he understood the deeper lesson. Respect should not be given because someone has influence. Respect should be given because someone is human. As weeks passed, Brian started approaching his work differently. He spent more time listening before responding. He became more aware of how his words and actions affected others. He no longer believed that being confident meant always having the fastest answer. He learned that sometimes the strongest decision was taking a moment to understand. One morning, David organized a community meeting where officers could speak directly with residents. He wanted the department to hear concerns from the people they served. Families, business owners, and community leaders attended the gathering. They shared their hopes for better communication and stronger relationships with law enforcement. Brian sat quietly during the meeting, listening to every person who spoke. In the past, he might have focused only on solving problems quickly. Now he understood that listening was part of solving problems. He realized that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned through consistent actions. After the meeting, Brian approached David. He thanked him for creating an environment where people could learn from their experiences instead of being permanently defined by them. David responded that growth was a choice everyone had to make for themselves. He explained that accountability was not about pretending mistakes never happened. It was about having the courage to recognize them and the determination to improve. Those words stayed with Brian. He knew the past could not be changed, but he also knew the future could be different. He began sharing what he learned with younger officers who were just starting their careers. He told them that wearing a badge came with a responsibility far greater than having authority. It meant protecting trust. It meant treating people fairly. It meant remembering that every person deserved to be heard. David watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He never expected Brian to become perfect. He only wanted him to become aware. He believed the purpose of leadership was not to create fear of making mistakes. It was to create an environment where people had the opportunity to become better after making them. As the department continued moving forward, the story of David and Brian became a reminder that difficult moments could become powerful lessons. The family that once needed help became the beginning of a larger conversation about fairness and responsibility. The officer who once judged too quickly became someone willing to listen. And the leader who had every reason to use his power chose instead to use it to create understanding. Because true leadership is not measured by how much control someone has. It is measured by how much good they choose to create with it. The changes inside the police department did not happen overnight, but slowly, a new sense of purpose began to take shape. David Mitchell understood that lasting improvement was not created by one speech or one decision. It was created through thousands of small choices made by people every day. He continued visiting different divisions, speaking with officers, and meeting with community members because he believed leadership required presence. A leader could not understand the challenges of others from behind a desk. They had to listen, observe, and remain connected to the people they served. Officer Brian Walker noticed that the department was beginning to feel different. Conversations that once focused only on routines and responsibilities now included discussions about trust, communication, and the impact of every interaction. Brian became one of the officers who encouraged these conversations because he knew how important they were. He remembered the person he had been before meeting David. He remembered how quickly he had reached conclusions without knowing the full story. That memory became a reminder of the officer he wanted to become. One afternoon, Brian was invited to speak with a group of new officers during their training. At first, he felt uncertain about sharing his experience. He knew that admitting mistakes was not always easy, especially in a profession where confidence was often valued. But he also knew that honesty could teach a lesson that a textbook never could. Brian told the new officers that wearing a uniform did not make someone better than the people they served. It created a responsibility to protect trust and respect. He explained that every person they met had a life beyond the moment in front of them. A person's appearance, background, or situation could never tell the entire story. The young officers listened carefully because Brian was not speaking from theory. He was speaking from a moment that changed his own understanding. Later that week, David received updates about the progress being made across the department. He heard about officers creating stronger connections with neighborhoods and taking more time to understand community concerns. These improvements mattered to him because they represented the reason he accepted the role of police commissioner. He never wanted to simply manage a department. He wanted to help build one that people could trust. At home, David reflected on the journey with Sarah. She reminded him of the evening when everything began. She remembered how easily the situation could have ended differently if David had chosen to reveal his identity. David agreed, but he also explained that the moment had shown something important. People often reveal their true character when they believe nobody powerful is watching. That lesson was bigger than one officer or one encounter. It was about how society chooses to see people. David knew there would always be challenges ahead. A department could not change its culture in a single day. But he also knew that change often began with one person deciding to do better. Brian's transformation became an example of that possibility. He was not defined only by the mistake he made. He was defined by what he chose to do afterward. Months later, the department held a community event celebrating stronger relationships between officers and residents. David stood among the people he served and watched officers interact with families, listen to concerns, and create connections. Brian was there as well, no longer simply following instructions but helping others understand the meaning behind them. The father who had once been overlooked became the leader who inspired change. The officer who once judged too quickly became someone who understood the importance of seeing people clearly. And together, they proved that the most meaningful transformations do not come from power alone. They come when people choose empathy, responsibility, and the courage to become better than they were before. Months had passed since the evening that changed the direction of two lives, but the lesson behind that moment continued to influence everyone who heard the story. In Atlanta, Georgia, the police department had entered a new chapter. The changes were not measured only by new programs or updated plans. They were measured by the conversations happening between officers and the people they served. David Mitchell knew that leadership was not about creating a perfect world. It was about creating a better one through patience, honesty, and consistent effort. He often reminded his team that trust was not something written in a document. Trust was something built every day through actions. Officer Brian Walker had become one of the strongest examples of that belief. The officer who once believed he understood a situation within seconds had learned the value of taking time to listen. He no longer saw patience as a weakness. He saw it as a strength. He no longer believed that authority came from having the final word. He understood that authority came with the responsibility to use that position wisely. One morning, Brian visited a neighborhood community center where officers were meeting with local families. He watched children speaking with officers, parents sharing their concerns, and community members feeling more comfortable having conversations with law enforcement. For Brian, the moment carried a special meaning. He remembered the family he met months earlier. He remembered David's calm expression and the choice he made to remain respectful even when he had every reason to respond differently. That memory reminded him that every interaction could become a turning point. Later that day, Brian spoke with David about how much had changed. He admitted that before their first meeting, he believed being an experienced officer meant he already understood people. David listened and smiled. He told Brian that wisdom did not come from believing you had all the answers. Wisdom came from being willing to learn something new. Those words represented the journey both men had taken. David had shown that power could be used to create understanding instead of fear. Brian had shown that people could recognize their mistakes and choose a better path. Their story became known throughout the department, not because of a single difficult moment, but because of what happened afterward. It became a reminder that one person's decision could influence an entire community. Sarah often told David that the most important thing about the experience was not the position he held. It was the example he set. She believed that their family had witnessed something rare, a moment where someone could have chosen anger but chose purpose instead. David agreed. He knew that real justice was not about making someone feel powerless. It was about creating a chance for people to understand, grow, and do better. As the years continued, the department kept moving forward. New officers learned from those who came before them. Community relationships became stronger, and Brian continued sharing the lesson that changed his career. He told others that a badge represented responsibility, not superiority. A uniform represented service, not distance. And every person they met deserved to be seen as more than a single moment or assumption. Looking back, David understood that the evening with Brian was never just about one encounter between a family and an officer. It was about a larger truth that extended beyond one city or one department. People are often judged before their stories are known. But compassion has the power to reveal what assumptions hide. In the end, the greatest lesson was simple. A person's true character is not revealed by how they treat those who can help them. It is revealed by how they treat those they believe have nothing to offer. And that is where true leadership begins.